I'm telling you, there's been so many developments in the Ukraine cinematic universe since the last time we talked about it. Where do you even begin? We've had new movies announced, movies canceled, we've had studio leaks, we've had director's cuts come out with alternative endings, new twists. There's just been so much insanity, it's hard to know where to even go. The one thing, though, that we do know for certain is no matter how much of a critical or financial failure the entire Ukraine cinematic universe is, the various studios that are producing it are going to keep pumping in money until the very end. Now, as a side note to just break character for a minute, I get it that it's very bad taste to make fun of this whole thing, to make fun of a war where tens of millions of people have had their lives destroyed, hundreds of thousands of people have died, that Ukraine as a country will probably never recover from this, and if it does recover, it'll be as part of, it'll have to be like a rump state, part of it'll be part of Russia, and part of it might even be part of Poland. But I just feel you have to laugh about this stuff, because otherwise it's just so depressing and so horrendous. It just makes you feel like drinking bleach. And maybe that's just a cope or an excuse. The other aspect of it is none of the people who are leading this war are serious people. Like, you have Ukraine announcing months in advance, we're going to launch this like big blockbuster offensive because we need to ensure that there's funding for the next season. I mean, more or less. The US is like, look, Zelensky, you gotta launch this offensive. It's gotta have a lot of explosions. It's gotta be like a Michael Bay movie, or else we aren't gonna be able to give you renewal for another season. You have everybody trying to hype this thing up to maintain public interest in it. You have, obviously, the NATO stuff where they're posting comparisons to Harry Potter and Voldemort, that kind of thing. And we have this picture, which I just saw pop up in my Twitter, and I thought this was a joke. I thought this was something that like some Russian troll had produced as a satire. But this is an official Ukraine government media outlet. This is the Prime Minister of Ukraine with his emoji, pray for fighter jets for Ukraine, when he went to Canada to beg Justin Trudeau to give him stuff. And this is where we're at. We're at like journalists writing articles like, all the women in your life have a crush on Zelensky and you have to accept that. And it's just, none of these people take this thing seriously. It's just a game. It's literally just another film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So that being said, let's just try to cover this one by one, because there's so much stuff. Let's start off with maybe the most cinematic aspect of this entire thing, the Nord Stream pipeline. So obviously the Nord Stream pipeline got blown up last year, and it immediately became like a Hollywood whodunit. It became like Knives Out 3, where we were trying to figure out who blew it up. Was it the Germans? Was it the Americans? Was it the Russians? Was it the Poles? Was it just some random dudes? And the answer that we came to was there was like 6 guys on a yacht who went out to the middle of the Baltic Ocean and using scuba gear blew this thing up. And from what I've been able to determine and what the German government is able to determine, this is physically impossible. I don't think they had equipment that would allow them to dive that deep. The German government mysteriously found this yacht with bomb residue and like all the plans on it and stuff. And it's like a bunch of, I think, pro-Ukrainian, like white nationalists or something who carried it out but weren't directly linked to the Ukrainian government. And like nothing about the story made any kind of sense. And then Seymour Hersh, who I think is a very questionable source, but he leaked that the U.S. government was behind it. And the U.S. government basically attacked national property of both Russia and Germany as part of the sanction plan against Russia to try to hurt it. And from what the latest Seymour Hersh leaks, and once again, I don't really trust Seymour Hersh, but this sounds plausible, is there's kind of this like understanding whenever they're having diplomatic meetings in Europe, where the first rule about Nord Stream is we don't talk about Nord Stream. Like, no one wants to bring it up. No one wants to say, hey, did the US just blow up a major pipeline as a way to try to gaslight us, pun intended, into a war with Russia? And they just aren't even like bringing it up. It's just the U.S. probably committed an act of international terrorism, and nobody cares. The U.S. has also started to impose sanctions on countries like Turkey, Hungary, and I think Cyprus as well, because they have business ties to Russia. So we have the U.S. sanctioning members of NATO who are also members of the EU. So they're sanctioning like their legal allies because they have ties to Russia. Now, all of Europe has ties to Russia at this point in time. I mean, let's be honest, Europe's still buying Russian oil. It's just being filtered through India. India's oil production mysteriously went through the roof as soon as Russian oil was embargoed to Europe. And so India started selling oil to Europe in the same quantities that Russia previously was at a marked up premium. But like I guess the thing is like the writing was they came up with this story. You got like the five good men, like six good men or whatever, some sort of Hollywood film. But it was dismissed as just being too convenient. The writing was too contrived. It stretched. People could not suspend their disbelief. However, the film got really good reviews from very prestigious critics. So everybody's just going along with it, and the Nord Stream movie is going to be a big success. Next, we have the bizarre phenomenon of the U.S. announcing that Ukraine is winning this war. We heard what General Milley said. Once again, if we believe the Cy Hirsch leaks, and I just bring it up because it's information so scarce, and this is if it's consistent with something else I've seen, I'll bring it up. So he said that behind the scenes, some anonymous source told him that the U.S. Defense Department was drawing up terms of surrender for Russia. That when the Ukraine cinematic offensive succeeded, that they were going to have a treaty ready, like the Treaty of Versailles 2.0. Or you know what? This is Eastern Europe. We could have Treaty of Brest-Litovsk 2.0. Now, I don't know if that's real. I mean, wouldn't that be something the State Department would draw up, not the military department? I do think, though, that is probably something that has happened, that they believe that Russia will have an unconditional surrender somehow in this war, and the U.S. will just be able to dictate terms to them. Because, like, from some of the leaked documents and just other stuff, the U.S. seems to be 100% convinced that Ukraine is going to, like, smash through Russian lines, even though they are at both a qualitative and quantitative disadvantage. They're going to smash through lines. They're going to retake all of Donbass. They're going to make it all the way to Crimea, and they're going to take Crimea. I think the expression was the Secretary of State or whoever was like, well, it'll be up to Zelensky what he wants to do once he reaches Crimea, if he wants to give the Russians a chance to surrender, or he just wants to go in and punish them. And it's just like, what planet are you on? Russia mobilized, what was it, like 300 something thousand soldiers back in December. They've been, or whenever it was, last winter, we'll say. They've been trained up this whole time. They've dug in. Russia's built, I think, in some places, like 4 layers of defense. Plus, they have at least a 4-to-1 advantage in terms of artillery. The amount of ammunition that they can fire on a daily basis. Plus, Ukraine doesn't have an air force anymore, and Ukraine is so depleted of its anti-air missiles that it's begging Cyprus and Greece to give it anti-air systems. Russia is starting to be able to use its military aviation. So I guess it turns out that, and this is the pro-Russian narrative, and this could be true or not true, but it does kind of make sense, that Ukraine entered the war with a large, sophisticated anti-aircraft missile system that they got from the Soviet Union, which seems plausible because the Soviet Union was known for its excellent surface-to-air missiles, because it relied on that more than it relied on air-to-air combat. And over the course of the war, it's either been used up or Russia has been systematically destroying it with cruise missiles. And Ukraine just doesn't have enough to protect the entire front anymore. And Russia's been keeping their air force in reserve. And now they can just basically use it with impunity, or at least with a much lower percent chance. Like maybe at the beginning of the war, there was like a 30% chance the plane will get shot down, and now it's less than 1%. So Ukraine is going to attack into 4 layers of defense against probably a larger number of soldiers, with soldiers who I think have gotten, like in some cases, 5 weeks of training. So basically untrained soldiers with a quarter of the artillery and no air support. And this is somehow like gonna work because it's gonna be like Braveheart, it's gonna be like Saving Private Ryan. They're just gonna run in. The Russians are gonna run away. It's gonna be like the Battle of Helm's Deep, except the Ukrainians won't have horses. I guess in the book they didn't have horses. They won't have armor. They won't have weapons. They'll just kind of run at them, and the orcs will just run away. And that's more or less like what we're being expected to believe. And Ukraine will just smash through across the entire front. The land bridge to Crimea will be cut. Why that even matters, I don't know, because Crimea was being supplied by sea and air for years, and Russia could just supply it by sea and air. But they're going to take the land bridge, and they're going to cut the land bridge, and then they're going to somehow invade Crimea. I don't even know how that's possible to do without air support, without a navy. Do they even have amphibious vehicles? I don't know, but they're going to invade Crimea somehow. Russia's going to let that happen. They're going to retake all the territory they lost in the Donbass. So let's just pretend for a minute. Let's pretend that this film is a box office hit. It's the next Avatar. The Na'vi rise up and they overthrow the Sky People. Let's say that the Ukrainian offensive slices through the Russian lines and retakes all these areas. What then? What is the end game? Because they've said we're not going to negotiate with Russia. The term for negotiating with Russia is literally giving them everything, paying massive war reparations, and like the Putin regime being dismantled. Russia's never going to agree to that. There's no reason for Russia to ever agree to that. Ukraine doesn't have the resources to invade Russia. The best case scenario is they can kick Russia out of all the territory, including Crimea, and then it'll just be a stalemate along the border while Russia fires cruise missiles and the situation just gets worse and worse and worse by the day. Like, what is Ukraine going to do? Are they going to invade? Are they going to go have a battle of Volgograd? Are they going to try to take Moscow? They have no way to win this war. The best they probably could have hoped for is to win a couple large victories early on, embarrass Russia, and come to some sort of negotiated peace. But they basically said there's going to be no peace. There's going to be no peace agreement unless Russia gives us everything we want, even though we're not in a position to that. My understanding is the original deal that was being negotiated upon was that the Donbass, the 2 republics, and Crimea would be ceded to Russia. The Ukraine would be partially demilitarized and have a limited army, but it would be allowed to join the EU. I believe that was the original deal, which honestly was a pretty good deal because the Donbass was gone, Crimea was gone. Those regions pretty clearly never really wanted to be part of Ukraine anyways. So they really should have just cut their losses at the beginning of this and come to some sort of negotiated peace. As it goes now, the longer this thing goes on, the worse the terms are going to be when Russia finally is able to dictate them. But like the Zelensky government there's no indication that they're going to give up. They're just going to kind of keep going. And if you look at Bakhmut, they're just throwing men into the meat grinder. I mean, the Ukraine has to run out of soldiers at some point, unless they're just going to start sending in like entire divisions of volunteer or contractor troops from NATO countries. I just don't see how this continues unless NATO intervenes directly. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories on all sides. Like, I've heard this thing that like Poland wants to LARP and rebuild the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that they've made a deal where they're going to directly enter the war in exchange for parts of Western Ukraine, and the whole thing is sounding like some sort of weird Hearts of Iron paradox game. But honestly, like, what else does NATO have? NATO is completely out of weapons. You see the Ukraine begging Cyprus and Canada, like, for weaponry. Canada doesn't have any weapons. The Canadian Armed Forces have been underfunded severely for decades now. I guess it has some Leopard 2s. It doesn't really have jets that they can give them. You have the various countries in Europe who promised, like, I think Slovakia, I think Czechia, I think Bulgaria, Romania, a bunch of countries promised all these jets. I don't know if any of them have actually shown up. They sent piecemeal a bunch of random tanks and infantry fighting vehicles over. But like if you look once again at the monthly weapon deliveries, almost everything the US is sending now is on back order. It's like here's 100 million rounds of small arms ammunition, which isn't that much, and 10,000 shells, so maybe a day and a half of shells, and a million shells that we'll be able to provide in 4 years. And once again, I mentioned this, I think, in my last video. Like, what was NATO's plan during the Cold War if they were going to have a hot war with Russia? They're not capable of, like, sustaining any amount of military production. And it's going to take them years to ramp it up to any amount of level. They can't even afford to have Ukraine lose at the rate it's currently losing at. So was this the plan if any war, like conventional war, broke out in Europe? They were just going to immediately use nukes? And that they never really seriously considered fighting a conventional war? Because they just seem to have basically nothing of anything. And who knows if any of these countries, my understanding is like Germany is years behind on ammunition, the UK is years behind on ammunition. The United States, with its massive military-industrial complex, is going to take a decade to replace all the stuff that it's burned through. And even estimates like that are based on the idea that the war with Russia will stop tomorrow and they won't have to keep sending Ukraine any stuff. So none of these countries have weapon systems anymore. The latest scam they've come up with, because South Korea has good relations with Russia and they don't want to directly send shells to Ukraine to kill Russians, so they're loaning shells to America. I don't know how you loan an artillery shell. It's like you fire it and then you give the shell casing back, I guess. So they're loading shells to America. America's going to send their stockpile to Ukraine. As one person put it, it's a shell game. And they're going to send Ukraine like 500,000 shells. So America at this point is like, it's not only depleted its stores, it's in a massive deficit. It's going to have to replace those shells with South Korea. And like I said, they're begging Cyprus for weapons at this point in time. So like, what was NATO's plan? Like, what happened to the stuff did they just destroy everything they stockpiled during the Cold War? Did they not, like what happened? It's so bizarre that they can't even fund a war for a full year, let alone longer than that. It makes me really wonder, like, Russia, maybe you should have taken your chances with Europe. They got nothing. It's going to be left in like a demilitarized zone that's going to take years, if not decades, to get somewhere close to the underfunded, pathetic state it was prior to this conflict. And the American taxpayers have to be asking themselves, what the fuck have we been spending the money on for the last couple decades? Like, if you look at how big the US's defense budget is, they can't even produce fucking artillery shells? Like, what is this? We can't produce artillery shells, we can't produce missiles, we can't produce any of the stuff needed to fight a modern war. We can build F-35s, though, that are too expensive and fragile to actually use. Are we going to give any of those to Ukraine? No, those are too expensive. We're going to build weapon systems that break easily and that are too valuable to use in combat. That is the 500 IQ, 40 chest plan I guess the US Army came up with. Like, you guys came up with the Sherman. You came up with this brilliant mass-produced tank that was made in the USA with great quality, that had decent armor, decent firepower, was incredibly mechanically reliable, that you could produce in huge numbers, and it just worked. And now we're at like the F-35 phase, and they aren't even sending that. So like, I don't know at this point. Unless NATO just starts sending in jets piloted by volunteer pilots, or send in volunteer divisions, and this becomes like some sort of, I mean, it's already kind of there, but it becomes the Spanish Civil War 2.0, where large numbers of both sides are made up of various ideological allies from across the continent. But like, once again, what is the best case scenario here? Ukraine is in no position to enforce any of its demands on Russia. The longer this thing goes on, they've already used up like 2 armies worth of equipment. The West has nothing more to give them. Once the big cinematic offensive happens, there's going to be no more special effects budget. There's going to be no funding for a sequel, no matter how much money this one makes, no matter how much, how well it's reviewed by critics, how much of a critical success it is. They aren't going to be able to launch another one. If anything, maybe Russia's just hoping that they will. I mean, Russia has proved during this conflict, and I was wrong, that they are willing to take big L's in the political arena in order to preserve their armed forces. I get now that holding Kherson was probably just not, if not, it's not that it wasn't possible, it just wasn't worth it, wherein they could go across the river. And it is humiliating to lose the capital of a state they just annexed. But it also meant that they didn't have to defend a city across a river. And now when the Ukrainians launch their offensive, they're going to have to be attacking across a river into fortified positions against overwhelming artillery and airplanes. But from all the leaks I've seen, nobody in the West is ready to give up on this. They're just going to keep throwing money into it. I don't know. Once again, I don't know where they're going to get weapons. Are they going to go through their own emergency stockpiles? Like the basic, they've given away all their extra stuff, all the stuff they had for long conflicts. Are they just going to go into like their normal, the U.S. Army's normal supply? Are they just going to go to random forts and just grab whatever ammunition happens to be out in the open and send that to Ukraine? Like, and that's where we're at the moment. They've just gone all in on this big film production. Who even knows if it's going to happen at this point? I mean, a lot of people are pretty sure that there's going to be an offensive at some point. There probably is, but who knows? Like, is Zelensky that crazy? Is he that irresponsible? Is the Ukrainian General Staff that irresponsible? Are his masters in Washington that irresponsible that they're going to keep this thing going? I don't know. The whole thing is just bizarre. And it's just, I don't know. I'm very bad at predictions generally. I kind of feel this thing is just going to go on for another year or so of just basically nothing happening and everything happening. It is truly Schrodinger's war. And maybe that will be the subtitle for this entire phase of the Ukraine cinematic universe. It'll be UCU Schrodinger's War. So I hope you enjoyed that video. God bless everybody. Pray that this conflict comes to an end and I don't know, just something happens.